struggling to find your ancestors on their ship passenger list? Are you wondering if the search is even worth it? Let's set sail on the high seas and let's explore passenger ship lists for our ancestors. Hey there, if we haven't met before, I am Lisa with Are You My Cousin, and this YouTube channel is designed to help you find your ancestors, grow your family tree, but not get overwhelmed in the process. So if it sounds like a cup of tea, you're in the right place. Now, ship passenger lists are valuable resources for us as genealogy research in the search for our ancestors. That information that we can find on the ship passenger list includes things such as certainly their name, their age, the date that they immigrated into America, their occupations, where their birthplace was, perhaps even the name of relatives back in their country of origin. I've even seen physical descriptions of the passengers. And in those ship passenger lists, sometimes I even find more family members that maybe I didn't know about. So there is a lot that we can find when it comes to exploring our ship passenger lists. Now, we certainly have to remember that over the years that the amount of information that a ship passenger list contained did vary and evolve over time. Some of those early ship passenger lists really didn't contain much more than a name and age and perhaps a destination or an occupation. But again, we need to be searching for those records to see what we can find out about our ancestor and determine sometimes when they actually even arrived here in America. Now, one of the struggles sometimes is when it comes to exploring ship passenger lists is actually just finding a ship passenger list, right? Now, certainly we can find many of the digitized ship passenger lists at the 4 big genealogy databases: FamilySearch.org, Ancestry.com, MyHeritage, and Find My Past. But we have some other options if we're having trouble finding our ancestor on a particular passenger list or finding the ship passenger list at all. Now, one of the things that you might want to do before you start your genealogy research into ship passenger list is to actually understand a little bit more about ship passenger list as a record set. Now, you can do this over at NARA, the National Archives. They have a fantastic website, and they also have information about the ship passenger list, what they were, and how they evolved over time. I'll have a link to that page down in the description below, but this is a great way to start to understand the context of that ship passenger list that you might find your ancestor in. Now, sometimes not everything survived, as we know, and you may not be able to find that ship passenger list. So maybe you haven't found that yet. Maybe it's the ship passenger list did not survive. Perhaps it's a name spelling, a handwriting, a transcription issue. But for whatever reason, you're having trouble actually finding your ancestor in a ship passenger list. Well, you have some other options that you could actually check for. One of those options would be to look into newspapers. So you want to include newspapers in your ship passenger list research. Now, why is that? Because newspapers would, first off, they would document things such as the arrival of ships or the departure of ships. If one was going to be delayed, either arriving or departing for some reason, they might note that in the newspaper. So if you knew that your ancestor was coming over on a specific ship and you were thinking they may have come in at a certain time period, you may find through the newspaper research that, wait, there was a delay or there was an incident that happened and that ship never arrived, or it arrived significantly later than was anticipated. And sometimes, certainly, tragedy occurred at sea. So ships may have encountered a storm, a bad storm, or there may have been a shipwreck at sea. And so what we see sometimes in the newspapers would be a list of perhaps survivors, may be listed out in the newspapers. And also sometimes we'll see that list of people who did not survive, perhaps a shipwreck, and listed in the newspaper as well. So this is another place for you to actually look for your ancestors and learn a little bit more about what happened to them. And in addition, sometimes when a ship came over, perhaps they encountered a really bad storm. So sometimes what you will see will be first-person accounts about that particular voyage. Was it a hurricane that they had to deal with? Was it just a lot of illness or cramped conditions? Whatever that might be, you may see some of that detailed out in a newspaper telling stories of personal accounts. Now, another place that you want to look for information about ship passenger lists and the ships that your ancestors may have come over on would be foreign language newspapers. Many immigrant communities here in America had their own newspapers, and they would have been written in their mother language. And often these newspapers could contain valuable information on new arrivals. Maybe it's new arrivals and they're looking for their family here in America, and they're trying to make that connection now that they're here. Maybe they're putting information about what was happening back at home in that newspaper. So these foreign language newspapers for these immigrant communities are crucial for your genealogy research. One thing certainly, if it is written in a language that you do not read, you will need to pursue getting it translated or having somebody assist you with that if you're not able to read it. But it can be well worth the effort for your research. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when you are researching your ancestor in ship passenger lists, there are some things that we need to keep in mind. Certainly, the information varied over time. Early ship passenger lists really contained only the minimal information, oftentimes the name, an age, hopefully, and that could have been it. So we need to keep that in mind. But as records evolved over time, we start to see more and more information in the ship passenger list. And if you're lucky, that ship passenger list for your ancestor will include things such as that ancestor back in the old country, or it may include things such as their last permanent address, and even their final destination or the person that they are going to be making contact with once they land in America. So just like when you're doing your census research for your ancestor, when you get a ship's passenger list, regardless of how much information is on it or how sparse the information is, make sure you are reading every single column heading and gathering the information from each column. Now, there are a number of challenges that we can run into when it comes to researching ancestors in these ship passenger lists. And one of those is, well, the misspelling of names. And I dare say, I'm not even sure I would call it misspelling because spelling could be so fluid over time, but perhaps it's an unusual or a non-traditional spelling of a name. And so we're not able to find it on our initial searches. Well, there are a couple of things that we can do to make sure that we can find their names. One of those would be a wildcard search. Now, I've done videos on this in the past, and I've also written some blog posts. I'll make sure I'll link those in the description below. But essentially, doing a wildcard search allows us to replace one or more letters in, say, that surname that's we're not quite sure how it might have been spelled when they came over, and it signals to the search engines that, hey, this is the name, but we're not really sure what those few letters might be or how the ending might be on that name. It will give us more options in the search results. Another way to overcome this issue of misspelled or mistranscribed names would be to spell that name out phonetically. Say it out loud how you think that it is pronounced, and then spell it phonetically. Then do some searches on those phonetic spellings. It may not be how it actually was spelled, but if you try doing it on some of the phonetic spellings, sometimes you get some more options that you might not have had in the past. Now hit that like button if you've struggled to find your ancestor in these ship passenger lists. It's comforting to know that we struggle with some of the similar issues in our research. Another thing that can cause us to struggle with finding ancestors in these ship passenger lists is really inconsistent dates. Now, dates on passenger lists could actually be written in a couple different formats, and we need to actually recognize that as researchers. Plus, you add in that poor handwriting and things can get tough really quick, right? So one of the things that we want to make sure that we can do to overcome that is to recognize if a different date format is used. So for instance, that ship passenger list may put the day first, then the month, and then the year, or they could flip it around so that it is the month first, the day, and then the year. So we need to make sure that we understand the format that date is written in. And we can certainly do that by cross-referencing our ancestors' immigration date and arrival date through other records such as the census record. Another thing that we need to keep in mind when it comes to the date that our ancestor came over is that we need to remember and assess their country of origin based on that date. In other words, we need to know what the border changes were. We have to be aware of border changes, and that we may think that they came from Lithuania, but in fact, when they came over, they listed their country as Russia. The ancestors may not have moved. It just simply meant that there was a border change that took place as wars and political situations changed over time. Now, sometimes you're going to be quite successful when it comes to finding your ancestors' ship passenger list, and that is a time for a genealogy happy dance, absolutely. But sometimes that success can be dampened a bit because of just, well, such sparse information that was provided. But after you found your ancestor on that ship passenger list, you can address this challenge of little information by seeking out supplementary documents, such as naturalization documents and even census records, where we can find occasionally some information on a person's naturalization status. So seek out your ancestor on that ship passenger list. Now, if you would like to learn more tips, tricks, and strategies for finding your ancestors in the records, be sure and watch the video on your screen now.